Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm proud to be the founder of the UK-based social enterprise, the Transparency Task Force. We're a certified social enterprise. We operate as a not-for-profit, and I'd like to think that we're an organization that's built a reputation for being very, very authentically purposeful. Our purpose is to promote reform of the financial services sector. We believe the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and therefore to political stability too. We want the financial sector to be more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. We've been operating since 2015, and to describe our experience to date as being a bit of a battleground would be quite accurate. It's been phenomenally difficult to create the kind of change that we want to see. And I'm going to help try to explain that because it's been far more difficult to do what we want to do than you might otherwise think. All we're trying to do is to get the financial industry to behave properly. You would think that you would meet no resistance whatsoever in that venture. But of course, to do it, you've got to get the regulatory framework that governs the way the financial sector to work to also be aligned with that objective. But then you say to yourself, hold on, surely the financial regulators are absolutely committed to driving things like transparency, truthfulness, and accountability into the sector. And at first glance, you say to yourself, yes, of course they are. They quite literally have statutory objectives about protecting consumers from harm, about market integrity, and all those kind of things. But as you get more experienced, and as you frankly become a little bit more cynical, you start to see the dynamics at play, and you start to understand how incredibly powerful the vested interests are. You start to see that it was naive to assume that everybody was going to be pulling in the same direction on the same rope, as it were. It was naive to believe that everybody wants there to be transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness. In the last few years, and folks, I'm just going to be blunt about it. In the last few years, we have become increasingly concerned about why it is so difficult to get the financial sector to behave properly. And those concerns take us to the awkward question: is our democracy working the way it's supposed to? Is our democracy working the way that we were brought up to believe it does? Surely democracy, where everybody has a vote to elect the people into power that we want to be in power, surely that means those folks in power are working for us. As you get older, as you get more experienced, and as you get more cynical, and as you read more and speak more to highly informed people, you start to see that the perceptions we may once have had about how simple and straightforward things were are actually remarkably inaccurate. And then you start thinking about and talking about what's causing things to not work the way that they do. Now, if I had my time all over again, I probably wouldn't start back in 2015 creating a community of people trying to reform the financial sector. I probably would have started my time either creating or supporting an existing organization that was in some way committed to preserving, maintaining, building on the quality of our democracy. With all those comments in mind, folks, I hope it helps you to understand why, when we learned about Peter Gigan and his book, Democracy for Sale, when we started to understand a little bit about him and his background and the work that he does, we frankly got quite excited about the possibility of having a conversation with Peter by way of this meeting, this event. I'd go as far as to say that not only would Transparency Task Force never achieve its objectives without the quality of our democracy being maintained, preserved, rebuilt, re-authenticated, but no progressive campaign organization is ever going to achieve their full potential if the very democracy that progress depends upon is not preserved and protected. This explains why tonight's conversation is off the scale important to me as the leader of the campaign group. It may hopefully be off the scale important to you. Ladies and gentlemen, could I please invite you to join me in, first of all, welcoming Peter to our meeting tonight and thanking him in advance for what he's about to say, and of course, for having taken the time and the effort to produce what is clearly an absolutely A1 topical and significant and relevant book for our community. We really do commend it to you all. Peter Gigan, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Peter, if I may, I'd love to start just by asking you to give everybody a little bit of context. So would you mind, please, Peter, just going back in time a little bit and telling us about yourself and open democracy and what were the passions that took you in that direction in the first place? Because we want to understand you a little bit as well as obviously the message, the narrative in your book too. So please turn the clock back and take us to the beginning, as it were. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, sure. And in some ways, they're kind of aligned. These things they're not separate as often people's personal narratives and their professional interlinked. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you very much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, it's I can provide some distraction if nothing else, but this side of the US election and the count starting, etc., etc. Yeah. So basically, I the story of me researching and writing about dark money kind of it. I fell into this story really. It's not a subject I wouldn't have thought I would be here talking to you about. Back over 8 years ago, back just if you can cast your minds back to just before the Brexit referendum, I was working as a freelance, a stringer for the Irish Times. I was at the time I was living in Scotland. I was working for the Irish Times. I'm obviously I'm from Ireland, and worked for the Irish Times on and off for years. And my editor there sent me to Sunderland, the city of Sunderland, to write what we call a colour piece in journalism vernacular, a piece where you take the pulse of a place before an election. I had always been interested in elections. I've covered elections and I'd done various investigations in my life as well. But anyway, I was in Sunderland just for about 48 hours before the Brexit referendum, and I was leaving. I spent the night and I was coming home, and on the train at Sunderland Metro station, I picked up a copy of the Free Sheet, the Metro, the newspaper. And there was a big advert on the middle of the newspaper which said, "Vote Leave, take back control." And that was the official slogan of the Leave campaign. And then I turned, just was kind of, I was waiting for the train, I looked, turned to the other side, and there was a big logo of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, and it said paid for by the DUP in Belfast. I thought this was very curious. I'd worked in Belfast before, so my journalism career had started in Northern Ireland. I'd worked I'd actually started off as an arts journalist in Belfast many years ago, 15 years ago. And that's where I'd started. So I knew a bit about Northern Ireland. I also had worked as a political reporter in Northern Ireland. I knew that political donations in Northern Ireland were kept secret. So I was interested in this. I thought that's very surprising. What's happening here is, how are the DUP paying for this advert? Why? It's not like them. This looks very expensive. And so then being a journalist, I took a picture of it and I put it on Twitter. And frankly, I then forgot about it. I sat on the train took me home, and I wrote my copy for the next day's newspaper. And a few months later, Adam Ramsey, who was then working as a reporter at Open Democracy, he gave me a call and he said, "Hey, I hear you've been interested in the DUP's election spending and their campaigning." And I said, I am too. And I said, "That's very interesting. Sure, let's have a chat." And the more we looked at, myself and Adam could see all these different bits of spending, but the DUP hadn't declared anything. which went they must have spent more than £250,000, which is a lot for the DUP. So put into context, they spent about £50,000 on the previous Stormont election that they'd won on the entire campaign. So we knew they'd spent more than £250,000 in this campaign. So myself and Adam we started putting together, we found different pieces of evidence, we put together this story about the DUP's donations, and the DUP refused to say where the money had come from. They wouldn't tell us where the money had come from. And so the story went out, and it was very big in Northern Ireland. At the time, there was you might remember, the Northern Ireland Assembly collapsed for a couple of years after following what was called a cash for ash scandal, which is all to do about the renewable heating incentive scheme in Northern Ireland, which has been used by particularly the DUP actually, and others to reward their supporters. And so in the context of this, the story broke and it became a very big story. And there was a live debate about there was a live debate on television around the head of the election, and our story was all the different people were asked about it, and Arlene Foster was asked about it, and she refused to say where the money had come from. So that became a big story. And then myself and Adam started going, well, actually, we've lots more stories to ask, lots more questions to ask here. We eventually managed to find out who the middleman for this donation was, a guy called Richard Cook, who was a Conservative councillor in a former Conservative candidate in Glasgow, who had actually, we discovered he'd gone into business with a former Danish gun runner and the head of the Saudi Secret Intelligence Service. At times it was a bit like an airport novel, but we found out all these quite incredible things about this donation. We also found out the donation was just under £500,000. Which was a lot, a huge amount, a significant amount in the context of the Brexit referendum. And we also found that the donation had been made after the Leave campaign had maxed out their spending, so they couldn't spend any more money, and they took this big donation which went to the DUP. And for me personally, that kind of started me on a journey of reporting and writing about these stories. I became very interested. As I said, I'd written my politics before, but not looking at this side of things, and maybe possibly because I wasn't someone who'd worked in the political lobby. I wasn't that, some ways, as probably jaded. I think if you're in the lobby for a long time, you probably become a bit jaded, and what to other people would seem kind of surprising and worrying becomes actually something that you just kind of go, actually, that's just the way things work. And it's okay that, for example, Azerbaijan was the biggest or the second biggest provider of fee trips to MPs between 2010 and 2017, the Azerbaijan regime. At the same time as lots of senior Azerbaijanis were buying property in London, that becomes okay, or something that you don't really think about all that much. I think that's what happens a bit if you get stuck in the lobby. So maybe it's because I came from outside that background. So then I joined Open Democracy as the head of investigations, and I started doing a lot of work looking at, beyond just a DUP donation, looking really at how money gets into the political system. That was the thing I became really interested in. And I became particularly interested in money that we can't see, anonymous money. So as well as looking at donations, I looked at things like online and misinformation, also anonymously funded think tanks, influence campaigns, lobbying in particular as well, and PR, and the relationship between lobbying, PR, and what we call the enabling industry, how lawyers and others can help rich people, particularly international rich people, to evade kind of sanction, not just sanctions, but sanction on their work. So I ran Open Democracy for a few years, and I left Open Democracy in the middle of last year. So I now run Democracy for Sale, which is the Democracy for Sale Substack, in which I write very regularly, almost every couple of days, about aspects of money in politics and influence. We're a small team. There's two of us. We're about to grow to three, but what we have done, I think, especially over the last couple of months, is really zero in on some of these topics, these issues around the power that money brings to politics, and often quite small amounts of money. Like thinking that we're talking about in the American election, it's worth remembering and worth noticing that when I first started doing these stories, I thought, well, actually, and everyone would say this to you, Britain's nowhere near as bad as America. There's way more money in America than there is in there's way more money in America than there is in Britain. And I think I kind of thought that too. It can't be that, maybe it's not as big a deal. But actually, when I started looking at British politics, I kind of realized, actually, because it's quite a small, closed political economy with very few people putting money into it, actually, this money can go much further. We saw that with Richard Desmond and Robert Jenrick before the housing development, where Richard Jenrick spent, I think it was about £8,000 or £10,000 buying a seat at a table at a Tory fundraiser. He gets to meet the then housing minister. He talks to him about his housing development. The minister calls the development in just before it would have been subject to about £50 million worth of tax from Tower Hamlets in it was the West Ferry development. So this is, and this is how influence works. I think for a long time in Britain we haven't really thought about this influence as particularly corrosive, but I think especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine, we're actually starting to see and look a bit more deeply at how what I would call this wider enabling an industry that politicians and politics is part of, but it's within a wider space. So that's kind of how I came to it. And it's very much, I kind of didn't expect to, but actually I've ended up dedicating quite a lot of time to it. I wrote this book as well, which was pleasingly seems to have been touched a nerve with a few people and been quite successful. And it's all really what I'm trying to do. Maybe a lot like you guys, I'm trying to drum up interest in transparency and accountability within these systems, because actually our rules are really, really poor. The rules that we have in the UK around elections and around electoral finance they're really poor. A series of cross-party groups of Parliament have said this. Commission on Standards Life has been banging its head against the wall for 15 years on this. And my big mantra is like, it's not about, if we just, there's rules out there, we could take them up, but we have a political class that doesn't seem to want to do that. So that's kind of very much where I approach it on Democracy for Sale. That's kind of the angle I take on these issues and continue to report.
Peter, thank you. That's got the ball rolling so nicely. Itching to ask you so many questions, and I'm sure other folk here are feeling exactly the same way. How would you describe what dark money in politics actually is? I mean, how would you describe it? What is it?
Yeah, so what dark money means essentially is that I take Jane Meyer, who wrote a very good book, the New Yorker journalist, investigative journalist, wrote a very good book called Dark Money about almost 10 years ago. And I would really, what she talks about in her book, and I think she really coined the phrase, and we now use it a lot in the context of the US, it's really any money that gets into the political system that you can't see. You can't see where the money comes from. You can't see where the funder is. So in the US, it's often to do. We see it a lot around some of the various PACs, some of the various super PACs that can. It gives people the opportunity to be kind of arm's length donors, and money goes into trusts, things like donors advised funds, and then then subsequently goes into things like super PACs. So in America, for example, you've got reasonably, for America, quite low levels. You can only as an individual give just under $1 million. It's about $124,000. But as anyone knows, you can give far more money because you can give money to a donor assisted fund, or you can give money to a PAC. And so there's ways around it. So that's basically essentially it. Any money that gets into the system that we can't see. What you see sometimes in the UK is we'll see sometimes money comes into what are called unincorporated associations. So unincorporated associations are, which was the case with the DUP donation, and actually gone through an unincorporated association, which was called the Constitutional Research Council, which sounds very grand, but really is a legal fiction. It's just a name that was dreamt up by, I assume, Richard Cook and probably nobody else, and who's only ever done two things, and it's made two donations, and that was it, and then disappears. And this is one of the issues we have. There's an issue around kind of money going into politics through unincorporated associations, through anonymously funded think tanks is an issue as well. One of the things I raise. Online spending as well has become a big part of how politics is done. But not just that, we don't have a properly functioning lobbying register, which I think is a really big issue. It's a big part of what I do as well, is looking at that. Transparency International reckoned that about 95 or 96% of actual lobbying that takes place isn't captured by the lobbying register. So it's all of that various structures where you can see money and influence happening, and we can't see it.
And in terms of the UK style of dark money in politics, how would you describe that? Tell us about that. How does it work in the UK?
And so in the UK, you're essentially talking about the big issue, I think, in the UK is it's around those two aspects of lobbying and influence. One is what we call think tanks that don't declare their donors. So we have what collectively known as Tufton Street, who have been very, very influential. I write about them quite a lot in my book. After my book was published, we saw Liz Truss was very close, and many senior conservatives were as well. So what I mean by Tufton Street is groups like the Institute of Economic Affairs, people like the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the Centre for Policy Studies, and others. They all don't declare their donors. I've done quite a few stories on some of their donors. Often, the one place where actually, ironically, we're able to find that information is from the United States. A lot of these groups have American charitable arms that take money and then disperse it into the UK. American corporate filings are actually very transparent. In fairness to America, it's actually very good. There's a good lobbying register. There's a good the FARA, the Foreign Registration Act, which I actually used for a story this weekend. there's quite good transparency documentation, which we just do not have here in the UK. So you can see some of their donations from that. We know people like British American Tobacco funded the IEA for years. BP did as well. But fundamentally, we don't know where their money comes from. And so there's a lot of issues around that because often that gets into media. And we actually could see a lot, I think, especially over the term of the last Conservative government, we could see a lot where issues that these very small sectional interests had an interest in started to kind of move up the policy agenda or move down depending on where the interests were of these sort of think tanks.
Yeah.
So a lot of movement from government. So that is a big part of it. When it comes to political funding, I think the issues are less around less around people. The DUP donation was quite unusual, and they did change the rules in the back of our investigation. I think one of the big issues we have is that the spending caps I do think are too high. The government changed the rules ahead of the last general election, partly because they thought that they were going to probably out fundraise the Labour Party and spend more money because they did under Boris Johnson. They raised a huge amount of money. That didn't happen in the end, but they did raise the thresholds for disclosures quite significantly. They're now over £11,000, which is quite high actually for the UK. Like £10,000 will get you access to somebody, and I think there's a real issue with that, and especially in devolved regions which have the same laws. Scotland and particularly Northern Ireland and Wales, £11,000 in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and Wales are very significant sums of money for politics. We've never really seen any declarations of anything like that in either of those jurisdictions, and Scotland is not far off it either. So there's a big issue around that. When it comes to Westminster, I think one of the big lobbying is probably the biggest place where we see what you might want to call dark money because we cannot see what is happening with the lobbying industry. We cannot see how lobbying and access is working. It's so opaque and so hard to track. And so that allows, and including foreign governments. I gave the example area of Azerbaijan, but there's others. I did a story recently about the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, which has spent huge amounts of money over the last 2 years flying people to North Cyprus, who've then come back to the UK and asked dozens of questions in Parliament all around Northern Cyprus, kind of pushing North Cyprus lines. That whole funding for that whole piece of work is completely and utterly opaque. And yes, it looks, hopefully there'll be an investigation into it from the Standards Commissioner, but these sort of investigations are often very slow to happen if they happen at all. So there's a number of ways in which we can see that money can influence our politics. And that's something that we're seeing more of, I think, as well over the last few years, because there is more money in politics than there ever was before. Post-Brexit, there's just been a huge increase. And also there's been an increase in people, especially we saw it under Conservatives, of people with questionable backstories donating large amounts of money. We saw it with the Conservative Party. We saw a number of their donors who had been at least linked in news reports to money from ill-gotten gains and the proceeds of crime and things like that. And we've seen a number of stories about senior donors, and that became more and more apparent as the Conservative Party went on in office. And I think there's a bit of an arms race going on, so we're raising more money, and in the process of doing that, there's more money coming from, I think, sources that are concerning than there was even 10 years ago.
This is really, really fascinating. It also ties into an event we ran last week called the Fraud Summit, which I'll mention a little bit more later, Peter. It may be of interest to you and other folks as well. You touched on the idea of the lobby register. Would you mind telling us a bit about how it actually works in the US? How would you like it to see? How would you like to see it working in the UK? And what I'm really interested in is presumably the idea of such a thing is getting pushback from certain quarters. How do the other side push back and try to narrate an argument as to why it's not necessary or not it's needed? I'm really interested in that dynamic because that must be a real battleground right now. The other side must be working so hard to prevent that kind of transparency coming about. I'll just mention in passing that Transparency Task Force is built on the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That very famous Justice Louis Brandeis phrase from 1914. So we want sunlight to be the best disinfectant. Always curious when people come up with all kinds of creative ways to say, no, we don't need it, we don't want it. Peter, the lobbying register in the US, how does it work? How would you like to see it working in the UK? And what do the other side do or say to try to push back against it? That's a really interesting one for me. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in the lobbying register in the US in terms of what the actual disclosure rules are, but they're clearly very extensive in that anybody who's employed as a lobbyist has to put down the lobbying register, who's paying them, what job they're doing, and who they're in contact with. which is just not the case in the UK at all. What we have is the Oracle, the Office of the Registrar for Consultant Lobbyists. You only have to register with Oracle if you are in communication with either a minister or a very senior civil servant. So a lot of lobbying doesn't hit that. You don't have to say what work you're doing for your client. You can just say their name, the Kingdom of Bahrain. That's it. You don't have to say how much they're paying you. You don't say what the focus of the work is. So there's a real opacity there. Most lobbying actually isn't even captured by the lobbying register in that context. So in the US, you get a lot more transparency around it. You get a lot more sense of, okay, who's doing what, and you can see it. And actually, interestingly, there was a story in Politico today that Ardent Strategies, which is Jim Murphy's lobbying firm, the former Labour minister who set up his own lobbying company called Ardent Strategies. After he left office, after he lost his seat, he went to work for Tony Blair, the Tony Blair Institute, and now he works for this one called Ardent Strategies. And what's interesting about the story in Politico today is it's about lobbying work that's going on in the States that Ardent Strategy are doing around Ukraine, pushing pro-Ukraine narratives. And they've got lots of information about it. And the reason it's a story, like on one level, in the US, it would never be a story because it's like just telling you what's actually happening. And there's nothing particularly untoward about what Ardent Strategy are doing, but nothing at all untoward as far as I can see. But the problem is that this organization has never really had to declare anything before. It's just made a first ever lobbying declaration, which it had to do about a month ago. But it's been clearly lobbying a lot for the last few years, but it's been lobbying Labour. But because Labour are in opposition, none of that lobbying is recorded. So like the time to lobby actually a government is just before they get into office because nothing is recorded. So that's the situation. What's interesting about the pushback side of it is the PRCA, the kind of professional body for lobbyists, is actually really in favor of lobbying reform. They don't like the current system. I did their podcast not too long ago. I was chatting to them a lot about it, and they're very open and vocal, saying they didn't like the system, and because they kind of see that there's too much room for scandal in the current system, which there is because it's so opaque. But clearly there is others who do not want to see reform. I think it's quite striking. One of the challenges I think we have, and it's an issue in America, but my sense is the lobbying industry is very big in America, but also lots of other services industries are in public kind of professional services industries. What you have in the UK is a lot of politicians go into the lobbying world after they leave office. And a lot of the time, frankly, what is being sold is the access to the new government. We saw that under the Conservatives, and we can see it under Labour, where you've not just got Ardent Strategies, which is Jim Murphy. You've also got Global Counsel, which was founded by Peter Mandelson. You've got also the Tony Blair Institute, which wouldn't describe itself as a lobbying firm, but is paid by people to do work, and has specific issues, particularly around AI at the moment. And there's I think one of the big problems in the UK is that the revolving door between politics and the lobbying world has been very, very strong. And I think that's acted as a huge drag on reform. And the great irony is the person who said we used to have no legislation, and then David Cameron famously talked about a quiet word in the run up to the 2010 election. He was talking about lobbying. He said lobbying is going to be the next big scandal. Then the big lobbying scandal of the last 15 years was David Cameron and Greensill. But if you look at David Cameron and Greensill, he never had to register anywhere, a single thing, because he was an in-house lobbyist, so you don't have to register. All of his correspondence, none of that broke the lobbying register. There was a series of parliamentary inquiries on the back of it, and nothing has happened because everything was actually fine. Nothing changed. Nothing was there was nothing. No rules were broken. And there's a few other issues. Full disclosure, Peter Mandelson's firm, Global Counsel, is currently under investigation by the lobbying regulator after a story I did about their work for the Qataris. And the issue in that instance is under the lobbying register, it's actually quite possible that international lobbying and international lobbying for other for other organizations for foreign countries isn't. It's very possible to do that and not be on the lobbying register, because the way the lobbying register was written, this sounds kind of nerdy, but you have to be VAT registered. And if you're based internationally, you're not VAT registered in the UK. So you can lobby in the UK for clients, even though if you're not based in the UK and you don't pay taxes in the UK. So it's absolutely full of holes. But as I said at the start, there's a lot in this where good practice exists. And just to pick up the point, I see someone talking about regulation. Of course, regulation is a huge part of this, and often what you see is lobbying around regulation as well. And it's a piece that we do a lot of work on, actually, Democracy for Sale. I mean, a few new stories working on No, not a surprise to hear, but a lot to do with the water industry actually, and looking at over
Yeah.
time the influence of lobbying and industry lobbyists. And what you often see as well is this moving from this is it's related but similar issue where people move from industry, from regulatory bodies. We saw this a lot with the water industry with Ofwat into the regulatee. You know, so they move from being in the regulator into the regulated body. And again, you end up at that place where there's communications can happen, all this, none of which is recorded. There's no transparency on any of that sort of information.
Peter, you've touched on this issue about the revolving door. We're really concerned about that within financial services. We've been involved with an international effort to try to do some things about it. I've spoken in Brussels about it. I've spoken in Italy about it. There were some really progressive attempts by some progressive European politicians to try to effectively create a charter that would help ameliorate the problem, help to mitigate the worst side of it. The revolving door problem almost encourages the kind of warped sense of loyalties and warped sense of priorities. Um, we think that it's a problem on several fronts. First of all, obviously, if somebody moves from a regulated entity into a regulatory role, how sure are you that they see their job in the regulator as being about the regulator's business, or is it really about them trying to influence the agenda of the commercial organization they just left and maybe going back to shortly after leaving that regulator? And of course, the other dimension to it, which is a little bit more sophisticated, is the idea that if somebody joins a commercial entity with the intention of at some future point in time joining a regulator, then bouncing back to a regulated entity, they may be on a multiple of their salary because they bring with it the kind of the dark secrets of that regulatory framework. These are real, really complex issues that are difficult to pin down. Let's talk about corruption. It's a difficult word in the same way that fraud is a difficult word. It means things are pretty serious. In your view, is it easy to distinguish between what is enthusiastic commercial endeavor, where companies are willing to throw money at those who can positively influence their agenda? Is it easy to tell the difference between that kind of stuff and what is essentially corruption? What are your thoughts about that C word, the corruption word?
I think it's interesting. I kind of followed Transparency International's kind of definition on corruption and Spotlighting Corruption, the UK NGO, which would do great work as well, or similarly, and the kind of the use or abuse of private office for personal gain. And that personal gain doesn't necessarily have to be your personal gain. I think that's an important distinction. I think there's a kind of sense in which, private office can be used. You can influence somebody else in private office, or private office can be used for somebody else's gain. I agree. I think it's a difficult word. I think in the UK, we've really struggled with it. I think you saw it during the COVID contracting story, which I reported on that a lot very early. I think I first started reporting on questionable COVID contracts in April of 2020. And we ended up with phrases like chumocracy and a kind of sense, I think, where we really struggled to kind of name some of the things we were talking about.
Yeah,
But I think it's quite important at times to kind of stand back and understand what does that word corruption mean? Like, it means more, it's a wider word than money in brown envelopes. And I think it's quite important to kind of get that across. The kind of sense in which public office can be used for others' private advantage. And that's, I think the COVID contract was the most incredible example of it in a way that I really didn't expect. I have to say, even I was really shocked and surprised by some of the stuff that came out
wow.
coming through that. This idea that people were able to set up companies who had no experience whatsoever. Michelle Mone, in some ways, like I've written stories on Michelle Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman, his business interests are, I'm sure people on this call and in your group have been very interested and are very, very concerning, I think. But also on one level, you almost have to feel sorry for her because she became the poster child that meant that nobody else really asked about what else was happening. How else did other things
Yeah,
happen? And
yeah,
what we saw was political donors were 10 times more likely to get government contracts. Well, that is a word, there's a real issue. That is the use of private office for public office for private gain in that instance. And that also loops back into how we run our politics. Because I don't think that the people who are making decisions, the Conservative Party ministers, etc., making decisions, were thinking, I'm going to get money at the other side of this. But they did expect that their donors would continue to support them. And that's a really important part of how we run politics. And unfortunately, when you run politics on private money, then this does tend to go hand in hand with it. And I think it's quite important to kind of to ground what we see in Britain around that. I think we have a tendency to get very, corruption something that happens somewhere else. And I think we've seen it, and we've seen very, what we've seen in some in councils, what happened in Thurrock, I think was incredibly concerning around the use of public funds there, and huge leverages and some people getting very, very rich on the back of it. We have seen the way in which contracts for political donors, etc. And I think it's quite important that we use that word when we need to use it, and we use other words when we need to use other words. And I think but more in general, though, I think that kind of thinking from the Transparency International lens around the relationship between public office and private gain is really important. And we've seen, I've seen on occasions where ministers are able to be lobbied by companies, say that a donor has. I've reported it so often where, donors meet at a meeting with a minister and they were able to talk. Nothing, no records are taken, but actually subsequently get the emails 5 years later on their FOI and they'll say, oh, just to follow up about this company or that company, and these are companies that they either own or have shares in, etc. And I think this is where this connects into politics. The Conservative Party and had its leaders group, which is if you give £50,000 a year to the Conservative Party, you get a quarterly meeting with the Prime Minister and other senior cabinet ministers all together. And which you have an opportunity to have off the record meetings and conversations with ministers. That is hugely problematic in terms of being able to sway decisions and being able to influence how decisions are arrived at. And those decisions can have huge, huge consequences because we're talking about a government, we're talking about a state of 50, 60 million people. So small regulatory changes in particular, I think that's often the thing. Planning is a great example. We often see it in planning and political donations. We've seen that's a huge bedrock of political support that comes from property developers. And small changes in planning rules and regulations can make huge differences to bottom lines in areas like that. And I think we have at times in the UK shied away from talking about those sort of things in the context of corruption and looking to really understand them and say, well, how do we stop this?
Mm. This really is fascinating. Of course, everyone understands tonight's a very big night for us in the UK, watching what's happening on the other side of the pond. Any particular points about what's happening stateside about that particular election and the money flows going into each of the two main parties?
This is just my personal reflections from looking at and reading and reading and looking at, like, it is America. The amount of money is incredible. You're talking about $16 billion open secrets estimates is going to be spent on this election. So these are huge. The British election, I think, probably will be about 80 million all told, maybe less. Which is a record for Britain. Could be a good bit less, but the US it's an order of magnitude better. It's bigger. It's huge amounts of money. What's fascinating to me is from the outside, you've got two things go on in America. It's what you do have is small donations. And just to give you a bit of context to the US, there was a thing called the McCain-Feingold Act in Russ Feingold in 2008. And I spoke to Russ Feingold for my book, actually. He was a Democratic senator. Obviously, John McCain was a Republican senator. And they came together and said, look, we want to take money out of politics. And they put together the McCain-Feingold Act, which was really good, really strong, really took the money out of politics. And some of that legislation still exists. A lot of the American laws, the laws I told you about, you can only donate up to 924,000. What then happened was a bunch of very rich people came together and took the Citizens United case. And the Citizens United case, Supreme Court judgment, which basically said that gave the statehood of personhood to corporate entities, and basically opened the floodgates for what we call super PACs, and allowed for huge amounts of money to flow into American politics. So what you had is an American political system that ran very heavily on a lot of money, a lot of corporate money, a lot of individual rich donors. Feingold McCain Act was trying to take that out, trying to take this money out of politics as much as they could, take out the dark money. And actually what happened on the back of it was this huge backlash that has made there's more dark money in American politics than ever before. Huge sums of money going to PACs. It'll take a very long time to unspool where all the money comes from. Actually, it can be quite difficult, especially when it goes into these DAFs, donor assisted funds, where it's really unclear where the money goes in and where it comes out. You can see the money going in, you can see money going out. The connection between the two is really, these are multi-billion dollar. It's intentional. It's intentional to say, look, we don't, who's to say, it's like, it's like water. Who's to say if this water came from this stream or that stream? So anyway, what I think is kind of fascinating is in America, you do have a big culture actually of individual giving as well. You can raise, both candidates have raised significant amount of money from ordinary people, something that in the UK, basically, the main parties don't try to do at all. But what you've seen is Harris has obviously raised huge amounts of money from across the board, lots of corporate support, lots of donors there who want something back. What I think is fascinating about Trump is Trump has struggled to raise as much money as Harris. He hasn't, but he's raised very big sectional interest money. So I wrote a story yesterday, which was about people who've donated to these Tufton Street think tanks, who amongst them have also donated to the Trump campaign, because we, as I said, we have US disclosures. And what I was really struck with was one company in particular, was British American Tobacco, have donated almost $20 million. I think it was 17 point something million dollars to Republicans and to Trump himself, and donated really nothing to I could find $960 to Kamala Harris and a couple of other minor donations. And what's interesting about that is that you can see that with Trump, a couple of industries, the tech industry in particular, Elon Musk, but also Peter Thiel and others. So some sectional interests have really gone in all in on Trump. And I think it's not unfair to assume that what you have then is, if this person gets into power, you get a lot more connect. We do know from some of the reporting that's been done that some of the decisions around making JD Vance a running mate and some other things were heavily influenced by Silicon Valley backers who basically said, look, we want this guy in, and if you want us to fund us, that's what the quid pro quo is. And so that looks like part of this too. So it's a huge amount of money, and whoever, like, and I think it's the Trump side of the equation, I think, is probably the most concerning, because you can see the connect in real time. Like Elon Musk wants tariffs on Chinese EVs massively because his business is struggling. Tesla is struggling. It's massive. And that's what he wants. He wants other stuff too, but that's what he really wants. And you can see where Silicon Valley comes from. A lot of that's not though to say that the big money that's going to Democrats is okay, because actually what we're seeing as well is a lot of big corporate money that is in there to try and influence the political agenda too. Like, so you're talking about record sums, and in an election it's as tightly fought as this, what promises are being made behind the scenes by the candidates to prospective donors trying to drum up money.
Peter, in a moment, I'm going to open things up for others to make comments, ask questions, and share their own insights. It's a really fascinating conversation. Before I do that, you mentioned British American Tobacco. I'd like us to spend a bit of time thinking about the human consequences of all this. Now, we aren't talking about, obviously, you know this better than I do. We're not talking about some kind of abstract or academic problem that only exists out there in the ether. It actually has real impact on real people's lives. When you mention British American Tobacco, I'm not going to mention who I'm talking about, but somebody who's very close to one of my relatives died a couple of days ago of emphysema. And this gentleman, the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years of his life have been absolutely horrific, absolutely horrific. Face masks pretty much all the time, every breath, every single breath was labored, pain, discomfort, anxiety. And we can all remember when smoking was really, popular. We can all remember the adverts. We can all remember how the tobacco industry fought tooth and nail to stop regulations coming in. And we've all seen how the tobacco industry selling its poison. I mean, how else can you describe that stuff? How it adapted by, leading to vapes, and how it resulted in, when things started getting clamped down in the West, how countries like India and Africa, etc., that's where they went. They said, okay, we can't sell this stuff so much easily over here now. Where else can we sell it? This really egregious form of aggressive, irresponsible capitalism has been allowed to happen. You touched on the water companies, I've been down in the Southwest recently. I went for a walk talking to a guy around the lake. He was telling me how this particular lake used to have loads and loads of fish in it. He was fishing it as a lot when he was a kid. There's no fish in it anymore, you know? So whether we're talking about the consequences of the kind of thing that the tobacco industry got up to, or the private equity firms, squeezing dividends out of water companies. When we think about the oil industry and the way that it systematically created a sense of doubt about whether climate change was or wasn't an issue, so much of that all kind of goes back to this issue that we're talking about tonight, the way that lobbyists use money to buy influence, democracy for sale. This is a hugely significant topic. When I think about the human cost and suffering in our particular area of interest, obviously the financial services sector, um, it's absolutely horrific what the consequences have been as a direct consequence of various kinds of organizations, banks and vulture funds and others doing what they do. In fact, allow me just to briefly show you something. You might find this interesting, Peter. I'm gonna share my screen. A lot of the folks here tonight will have seen what I'm about to show, but it might be interesting for yourself. So this is Violation Tracker. It's a database that tracks violations. We're pretty close to this. We're very big fans of it. And
I
if
use my work just a thumbs up. I've
Oh,
used
that's great.
my work.
That's
Yeah,
great. We, we
great.
we we stumbled across this when there was only the American version, and we encouraged the folks in Washington DC to
Oh,
create
I'm
a
delighted.
UK
Thank
one.
you very much for doing that, guys. It's been a great service.
That's great. And there's now a global one. We help to promote that. And if you go to, you're probably familiar with this route to search. If you go to the other summaries, and then you go to it gives us to click on parent industry totals. And the worst violating of all the industries is financial services. You can see it at the very top of that naughty list there. And you click on financial services, it gives you the 10 worst offenders, and then it gives you the fines individually by size of fine. And when I stumbled across the US version of this about 4 years ago, it was on a Saturday morning, Peter, about 10 o'clock. I ended up spending like most of the weekend studying it because what I started to see when you scroll down the different individual offences, you end up with this upsetting realization that the companies that are doing the bad stuff that they're doing carry on doing it.
Mm.
They're recidivist. They
Yeah,
carry on doing what it is they've been caught for. And then you say to yourself, there's something going wrong here. If the
yeah.
purpose of the regulator is to actually prevent bad conduct, what's happening here is XYZ naughty bank does something bad, makes a fortune out of it. The managers get enormous bonuses as a consequence of it. The regulator eventually investigates, prosecutes, fines, whatever. They find the innocent shareholders of the company, typically us through our pension schemes and all the rest of it. And there's hardly ever any kind of individual accountability for the people who actually caused it. It's heartbreaking. And the reason it's heartbreaking is because of the human suffering all this stuff causes, We're not talking
Yeah.
about abstract adverse activity here. We're talking about people, some of whom are here tonight, who end up having their houses repossessed because a vulture fund's being allowed to let loose on a mortgage book. It's genuinely upsetting. I'll try not to go off on one any more than I have, Peter, but it really is so important. The work that you're doing to expose the opacity in the system is absolutely critical. Folks, allow me, please, if I may, to invite anybody that would like to raise their hand, either literally or digitally, to let me know that they'd like to come in with a comment or a question. I know Mark Bannis is here. I know Nigel Keynes is here. Really keen to get folks' opinions from whoever you are. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Martin White first. Martin, turn your camera on if you can. If for some reason that's not appropriate, that's okay. But otherwise, take yourself off mute, Martin, and share with us your thoughts. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for everyone who's contributing today. It's nice to see the number of attendees has grown during the session. At the beginning, it was quite limited, and it's now quite good. Relatively recently, I heard about a book called The Unaccountability Machine by Dan Davis, and this is relevant to how decisions get made in in the corporate world, and how we end up with nobody actually taking the blame. Obviously, very obvious, well known example, of course, is the post office, but really, in all of business life, and I guess also political life, things are done in such a way that you develop a sort of algorithm for taking decisions. Not quite that the computer says no, but you develop an approach and you apply this approach. This is our policy, and no one person ends up taking responsibility. And of course, what we've seen in so many cases, whistleblowing was a really powerful one for me, how the people who are really responsible actually get away with it. One of the things that he talks about at the end, Dan Davis, is he would like to see a rule that when a company that's geared takes over another company that's geared, it should assume responsibility for the debts of that company. So you can't play the kind of tricks that private equity like to try. In other words, stopping people take excessive advantage by gambling with other people's money. That's it for me. But that person might be interested in talking to in this space. It could be worth approaching if we haven't already done so. That's it for me. Thank you.
Martin, thank you. Do us a favour, Martin. Can you pop me an email about that? Because that's actually a really interesting line of thought. I'd love that. In fact, when Peter was speaking earlier,
I popped it in the chat, Andy.
Oh, good man. Good man. Thank you very much. When Peter was speaking earlier about the lobbying register, I started to wonder whether we could be part of an organised coalition of like-minded campaign groups. I can see Emma's got a hand up. We'll go to Emma shortly. Before we go to Emma, can we go to, and obviously Peter, please chip in at any point, obviously. But let's go to Mark Bannister, then Nigel Cairns, then we'll go to Emma. Mark Bannister, share with us what your thoughts are, please. Thank you.
Peter, first of all, thank you for writing your book. I'm rather intrigued, so I shall buy a copy and have a read and educate myself further. I would ask you, though, what do you think the solution is to this problem, or how you would propose to address it? I have certain thoughts, but they're born of ignorance rather than informed study, as you have obviously done a lot of work on this to analyze the problem and address it and speak to it. So you must, I presume, along the way have formed some thoughts about how it might be addressed.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, actually, I would point to it didn't get much coverage because it came out on the day Rishi Sunak announced the general election, but Spotlight and Corruption did some very useful work where they took all the various recommendations of people like the PAC Act, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, Commission on Standards on Public Life, and other like kind of similar cross-party committees and Commons. Put them up for the last 14 years that had to do with kind of electoral integrity, transparency, accountability, and public life. They put them all together and created a matrix and like a tick box of what's been done and what hasn't, and put all the ones that haven't been done into a kind of a very useful. It's a couple of pages long, but I think it's a lot of that stuff is there. There's a lot of stuff that could be done. There's a lot we could do that is kind of off the peg. It's not reinventing the wheel. Like there's stuff that works in other jurisdictions as well that we could pick up. There's still issues. And I think a lot of other there's not one panacea. There's not, I think, one magic bullet, but there's quite a few things that we could start to do. And I guess I found quite dispiriting is that the Labour Party were quite good on this a couple of years ago. There was ethics and integrity. We would have a much stronger curbs on revolving doors, make it 5 years rather than the current 2, in which you can move into an industry in which you're regulated. And actually, ACABA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, is a complete fig leaf. It has no powers whatsoever. All it can say is we don't like that very much. So move off that into something with some sort of proper standing that can actually do things like fine people, etc., etc. So there's quite a few different things that we could do there. But it's felt like since the new government's gone into power, that these issues have really gone off the boil completely, and we're not really seeing very much. We did see Keir Starmer wrote a piece in the Guardian last week talking about some various things like this, including SLAP, strategic litigation against public participation, which I think is part of this in times. The way the law is able to be used to stop people like fraudsters and others to stop their names getting out into the public. It allows people to sue journalists and sue campaigners and sue others to make sure stories don't get out. It's an issue I cover a lot.
Yeah,
So
the problem there, though, just to interrupt you, is that Keir Starmer seems to be the beneficiary of a slap order, not that we're supposed to know that, himself. And so one rather wonders whether there's not an element of hypocrisy in all of this, that he can't, in fact, bite the hand that's protecting him.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I'm going to say I don't know about that. But if you
Well,
any details
none
on
of us
that,
should know
I'll give you
about
a
it,
shout.
which is,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course, the whole purpose.
But no, in general, I think
Rumour
there's definitely an issue with this, and we've seen it in general. I think this is part of. I think one of the, and I don't know what the, I don't one of the bit I don't know the answer to is how do you change a system, and how do you get out of a system where I think it's very deeply rooted. So say you're in government and you're a minister, right? You know that some of the people that you're in whatever department you're in, there's a good chance you're going to end up on a bunch of nice paying boards on the other side of it. You have a short career, you could be out in your ear in a couple of years. And on the other side of it is like quite well paying gigs for doing not very much money for the rest of your life if you're quite senior. If you're more junior, less so, but if you're quite senior. And I don't know how we get out of the way in which it's less that you're likely to act in favor of one company or another, but there's more of a systemic area where you go, actually, you know what, maybe I won't do that. Just in your head.
Yeah.
I think this is the big problem. I think there's a real, it's a bit like what we saw with some of the kind of issues around gifts and the Labour Party in the last few months. It's less about someone a quid pro quo. And I thought the Premier League is a really good example of this. The Premier League is agitating very hard against a football regulator. The Labour Party, particularly Keir Starmer, takes lots of gift from the Premier League. The government says they're still going to have a regulator. That's good. But how does that influence play out in the course of that? Like and we can't see it. I think this is in some ways, it's a bigger esoteric question, but like how do you end up in a position where politicians aren't thinking about, well, who's going to give me a paycheck on the other side of this?
Just staying with this point, Peter, do you think it would be possible conceptually or even in the real world to strip out money from funding political parties and politicians? Is that an idea that's just too unrealistic to even think about?
I think it shouldn't be, or at least because what's funny about it is we have short money, so we already fund politicians and politics. Just no one realizes that we do. Short money is a big thing. The reason Conservative Party are broke, or one of the reasons they're broke at the moment, is that they've very little short money because they lost most of their MP. For every MP, every councillor, parties get short money. We've had that for quite a while. And
forget my ignorance, Peter. What do you mean short money? I don't understand it in this context.
Short money. Well, I can't remember his first name. It's named after a man called Short, Mr. Short, who brought it in. And basically, the idea is you do give parties money. Parties get money from the state. It's not enough to fund a political party in total, but the idea is you do, and the money can be used for policy development, to run your political party. It's an acknowledgement that actually parties do need some support, because otherwise they're completely beholden to donors. Or in some instances, if you're not a political party that's likely to raise money from donors, then how do you function? So it's there for a while. It's been there for a while, but we don't really talk about that. But more generally, I think there is a kind of way. There's different ways you could do it. There's more creative ways than just having the state give political party money. And I understand in Britain, for whatever reason, that's mainly what they do in the continent. But if you don't want to do that, one thing you could do is increase the short money and then do other things too. Like I would think we should cap donations. I think £10,000 is enough for anybody to give into politics. I think across the board, no one will go, you should be able to give more than £10,000. But what we could also do is say, if you make donations, say up to £200, the state will match fund them. Maybe match funds it a couple of times. So we encourage people to give small amounts of money, and you can make it really transparent. Like on the FEC, the American Electoral Register, which I spent my weekend trawling through, is very good. You can see tiny donations. People have to register very small donations. So you could just register all those donations. So you could actually check them out. You could check out that they're legit, and you could match fund them. You could make members of political parties VAT deductible, and effectively make it free. So there's things you could do. There's more creative solutions than anyone's really tried to bring at this problem. I think that's my frustration with this, is that there really has been very few. I gave evidence to a thing called the what was it called? The Commission on Power in the Lords. The name's forgotten. It was a Baroness. Oh, it'll come back to me. Anyway, there's this commission that was looking into power. It was been going through the House of Lords, and it looked like they got some really interesting people, really interesting recommendations. I give evidence to it back in, I think it was back in December, but it's a Lords Commission, it's a self-appointed Lords Commission, so it's not going to go very far. And I think this is part of the problem. And the biggest problem is, I guess, is that every time a political party wins an election, it seems to think that the system is going to help them forever. And I think that's where the Labour Party currently is. And the Conservative Party does run on private money. And that's one of the other issues, that you do have a duopoly party system in which one of them is really beholden to private money and does not have very many members. And that creates a slight an imbalance in that respect. But yeah, I think there's a lot you could do. It's just there hasn't been. Yes, that's it. That's the commission. Yes, and
Right.
the recommendations were really interesting, and we're reading. So there's stuff that can be done. I think the challenge and the frustration for someone like me is that it doesn't feel like the conversation's ever really evolved.
I guess the catch-22, Peter, just a quick point for me before we go to Nigel. I guess the catch-22 is, and this of course is an oversimplification, but if the party is in power, whichever party it is, if the party in power got into power with the help of the very kind of inducements, encouragement, support that we're talking about, then it would actually be completely irrational for that organization, that party, to then undo what got it into power. So we end up with this horrible catch-22 that the entity that needs to solve the problem is the one that hasn't got the power to solve it. Do you know what I mean?
I do. No, this is basically, I think that's very much it. That is essentially it. And it's what we've seen over the last few months too. I think it's a what do you call Zugzwang?
Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. We'll go to Nigel, then we'll go to Ross, then we'll go to Emma. Nigel Cairns, thank you.
Oh, hi, Peter. Yeah, it's a very interesting talk. And I'd just like to mention something that came to mind when you were speaking earlier in relation to the revolving door problem. And it's to do with the endemic nature of the revolving door problem and its magnitude. Now, the example that came to mind was comes from a couple of years ago, and I saw an account of this published on the internet somewhere, and it's since disappeared. I can't re-find it. But it was an account from the chairman of somebody in the Treasury that was charged with deciding what the suitability and the terms and conditions of somebody leaving their career in the Treasury and going into private business. And they had their own code of conduct of how this should happen. And it was actually somebody very, very senior that had a complete career in the Treasury that had been offered a very senior position. I think it was a board position at Barclays Bank. And I can remember reading the rationale of the decision that was arrived at, and I think it was a Lord somebody or other, that decided, yes, this person should go. It was something fairly small time-wise, 2 months or a very short, relatively short period of time between leaving the Treasury and before winning Barclays. That was a sort of a fig leaf of respectability for secrets or everything else.
Yeah.
But the rationale that was given at the time was that this person would be getting in the order of 10 times the salary or more than that they were getting and had got for their entire career. And if the Treasury was to stop this practice, it would mean that they would be unable to attract the level of talent that they needed in the Treasury to conduct their business properly. And the only way that they could reward people was to allow them to go into private industry at ridiculous salaries with all the secrets immediately afterwards. So this is policy of the civil service, supposed to be apolitical. And of course, we see the situation where the Treasury, the civil service, supposedly independent of the independent FCA, are constantly deliberating between themselves about the revolving door problem, as far as the FCA and authorised firms are concerned. So they're deliberating on the problem that they're promoting the existence of in the first place. So the reason I raise this example is that in order to solve the problem, you have to know where to start to attack the problem. And I think unless you can start to solve it at that level and in that sort of place, you've got no chance further down the line of doing anything at all about it. So ultimately, this is a matter for politicians, independent-minded politicians in the Houses of Parliament, and it can only happen that way through pressure of individuals. And of course, you know, the electorate is deliberately kept at arm's length and in complete darkness, as you know, in regards to how their lives are actually controlled. So I think there's an information problem there as well.
Thanks, Nigel.
So, but it's basically all comes down to the power of lobbying, the endemic situation that sort of rolls along as an inherited, and the fact that might is right as far as power is concerned, and money rules the whole thing. So,
money
not that
before,
I'm cynical, but
money before morals, and what is the other one? Profit before principles. Thanks, Nigel. Please, anything on that before we go to Emma, just in case you want to.
No, I would agree. I think the inducements issue, and I think I know exactly what you're talking about. You're probably looking at an ACABA disclosure, probably from Lord Pickles, Eric Pickles, because they have to write it down. It's quite remarkable reading this, and it'll say something like, "You're not to have any conversations that will involve anything that you used to do in your former job," and it's like, of course. How are you going to police that? Do you really expect this? No one expects that. And I think this is complete. And you're right. This becomes it's a form of inducement. You expect if you do 15 years of the MOD as a senior civil servant, you'll go in and work for BAE Systems or someone for 5 times the salary.
Yeah, well, Barclays will be expecting to get value for money for their what they're spending, aren't they? So.
No. You've got this all wrong. I'm afraid to disabuse you for this notion. What you're paying for is all the benefits you've already acquired. The benefit is all long since. It's the payment that's catching up with the service that's going on.
Well, of course, speaking to your point, Mark, in actual fact, what makes the matter worse is that as people rise up in the Treasury or in their final years, they want to position themselves to be as marketable as possible, and you know, as appealing as possible, to be paid the highest possible salary by the highest bidder.
You guys
so they're prostituting themselves.
You guys are making me think of that very, very wise comment by I forget this Warren Buffett's right-hand man. I forgot his name. Anyway, the quote is
Charlie Munger.
Charlie Munger, thank you very much. Yeah, the quote is, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Yeah, if everyone behaves in accordance with what's in their personal interests, you end up with what we've got.
Andy, the key thing there is that traditionally you would think that the action would follow the reward. But what you sometimes have to recognize is that they invert. And so in this case, I'm prepared to bet you £1 to a penny that he'd already supplied the benefit.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've just before we go to Emma, what you've just said makes me want to read out a note I made to myself. I'm reading a book at the moment. Well, it's on Audible. There's a great book about, if you like, people-powered capitalism. I'll put a link to it in the chat. There was a bit I listened to over the weekend which really got my attention. So some of you will know that the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, and the Glass-Steagall Act was all about protecting the system from the kind of abuses that led to all kinds of financial crises over the years.
Well, there's a separation of responsibility between commercial banking and effectively merchant banking.
That's it. And what I learned over the weekend from this book was, and I made a note, I'm reading it on my phone here, the Citigroup campaigned for the abolition of Glass-Steagall. Okay, in 1998, it bought an insurance company called Travelers. Essentially, that should have not been allowed, as I understand it, because buying an insurance company was in breach of Steagall, but it went through anyway. A guy called Robert Rubin was head of the Treasury in the US at the time.
Correct.
He actively campaigned for reform. Okay, this is the bit that really got me. He left the day after a vote was passed to make the reforms that he had lobbied for happen. Listen to this bit. He left in July 1999. 3 months later, he joined Citigroup on a job for which he was paid $20 million, right, a year, even though he had no operational responsibilities. I mean, that sounds like one hell of a gig. No responsibilities. Here's 20 million quid. Before I go into that any further, I'll go to Emma. Emma, lovely to have you with us, Emma. Emma, please tell us a bit about yourself and your organisation. I can see it's called Citizen Kind. So tell us about that, and then please share with us whatever you'd like to, Emma. Thank you.
Oh yeah, hi everyone. This is the first call like this I've been on, but I'm a big fan of Peter and follow him on Twitter, which is how I've been.
Oh, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
I set up Citizen Kind in 2018, born out of frustration. I had been living in Singapore and I was running a recruitment firm which was helping companies that were responsible for some pretty heinous stuff find brilliant candidates, and it slowly ruined my soul to the point that I couldn't do it anymore. So I had to go around the world and for a year and just discover where our food comes from to help readjust where I wanted to put my focus next, and ended up coming back to the UK and then set up Citizen Kind as a vehicle really to help a positive, sustainable food transition happen by putting all of my energies into that. And so here we are 6 years later and not a lot has happened. But actually food is one of those things that I think gets overlooked in the discussion around democracy. And I think people aren't really aware of how much lobbying goes on from big meat and big dairy, and how much is actually happening outside of this country, which is affecting people here and government here. So in the US, the big meat paid $1.5 billion to create a Masters of Beef advocacy program, which is essentially an online troll training camp where they were helping to spread misinformation around food and around ultra processed food. That's where that originated from. This was last year they did this, and really it's been an enormous campaign, and there's no way that any broccoli council could possibly have against this, but of course that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the stuff we know about. There is so much more that goes on behind closed doors in places like Brussels and of course here in the UK, that I wanted to bring it up just really because I feel like it's an area that is so far untackled in this country. And just on the point of what one of the solutions that we have, having lived in Singapore, what they do in order to make sure that their government is uncorruptible. And I mean, they have lots of issues when it comes to, they don't even pretend to be a democracy like we do. But they pay their government employees so much money that they are uncorruptible. And the number one job that everybody in Singapore who is a Singaporean wants to get is a job in government. And it is a real aspirational thing. And so it's something that people, if you asked any Singaporean child in school what they wanted to be when they grew up, then they would say, I want to be in government.
Wow.
It was quite a contrast going from here to there. But I think the thing that shocked me more about coming back is just how little democracy I came back to, and learning about how much influence these lobbies had and how they operate, and really that it really is democracy for sale. And also, of course, that there's incredible spending that goes on that is also opaque in government subsidies going to food, which is essentially creating the climate crisis that we're all suffering
Yeah.
from. You know, these things aren't in the public consciousness, and that they're continuing to spend the amounts of money that they are every year. It's not even on the docket. It's not even up for discussion. Like, what? How on earth are we supposed to tackle this?
This is such a huge area, isn't it? I guess every single industry has got its version of the things that we see in financial services. Here you are, Emma, telling us about ultra-processed food. Financial services does it. The pharmaceuticals industry, I know. The opioid crisis, I mean, what was that all about? Jeez. The tobacco industry we talked about.
The opioid crisis being an incredible example as well of the Purdue Pharma. It's a grimly fascinating story, but the reason Purdue Pharma were able to market their super strong OxyContin as non-addictive was all because of an FDA leaflet that was drawn up by a guy who went straight through the revolving door and worked for Purdue Pharma, huge on the other side of it, and had been tapped up beforehand.
That revolving door problem is definitely a big part of this. We did some work with a lovely Italian MEP, Sabrina Pignadoli. We did some work with her around the revolving door problem. Her background, really interesting lady, actually. She was a journalist, and she was a journalist who was brave enough to write about the mafia in Italy. But she did it, and she became an MEP, and she became a very forthright person campaigning for, getting rid of corruption and stuff like that. We need more MEPs and MPs like that, I think. Let's go to Emma. That was very interesting indeed. Thank you for that. We'll go to Ross, and then we'll start bringing our conversation to a close. If you've got any other comments and questions, folks, you'll be squeezing them in. I can see Martin's got his hand up. We'll be delighted to hear from Toby or from Aaron or anybody else. But let's go to Ross now. Ross, thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm the gentleman from Canada, actually traveling in Portugal right now. We may think Canada's lily white, but our financial industry corners 47% of all corporate profit in Canada. For perspective, the US is 25 to 30%, even though they've got Wall Street, etc.
Right.
I went to school with 4 of us got MBAs. I majored in operations research. My 3 friends majored in finance. They're now worth about $100 million each. So you can see the financial industry is very powerful and strong. Andy, you may want to put my website for the story of Canada. It's called fixthecpp.ca. It gives quite an interesting story of dark money in Canada. But my question, Peter, for you is the lobbying and the corruption that's going on. I think 98% of citizens do not want it. Why does a left-wing party, and none of them seem to have done it in the US or UK or Canada, why does a left-wing party not say the following platform? We're going to hire an external auditor, and he's going to map every dollar that comes into the party and every dollar that leaves the party for spending like TV advertising and all those expenses that are logical that a party should have. And everybody's going to be identified with the money that they put in. And that's going to get the left-wing party elected. And the other thing the left-wing party can say is, if we do this, we will save you as a normal taxpayer, let's say, I'm guessing, at $500 a year, because there'll be no corruption and more money to spend on social programs or whatever's needed to help the normal people.
It's a really good question. It's the thing I find myself looking at time and again. Why, if particularly of a left of centre government, why would you not come in and go, right, this isn't in our interest? Because it isn't really long term. This isn't in our interest. It's very popular. People don't like this. It's not, and these are not relationships that there really is much of another side on. But I find it, frankly, I do find it really, really baffling. And the only thing is, to return to Andy's point, is that in the journey into power, you collect all these people that once you get into power, you then feel you are then beholden to. I do agree. I think it's not as if these are things that the general public, are mixed about. It's very clear where people stand on this.
I think I'm right in saying Obama made a huge effort to try to get loads and loads of little people donating, didn't he? If I remember rightly. Yeah. I don't know much about politics, but I do remember that. I thought that was a cool thing to do. He got loads of people.
He did. It was very successful. Yeah, it was very successful doing it. It was a big, big drive, and they were really successful doing it.
Yeah,
And there
yeah.
is potential there. I think like I think you can have that conversation with people and says, look, instead of us taking money from these rich people, why don't you give us some, I think
Yeah,
there's a sophisticated electorate there.
Thanks very much, Peter. Ross, at least one person here tonight would like to connect with you. So if you're happy to, Ross, just pop your email address into the chat, and anybody can contact you if they'd like to know more about the work that you do. Okay. Thank you, Ross. Do check out Ross's website. You'd be amazed at the shenanigans going on in Canada. I love the word shenanigans. It's not quite over the line, is it? It's just about good enough a word to make the point without getting locked up for it. Shenanigans. Mr. Martin White, we're back to you. Then we'll start bringing our conversation to a close. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Andy. I was particularly taken by what Ross said about the profitability of the financial sector in Canada. I had no idea that it was as extreme as that. That's really quite something. Point I wanted to make was how the issue of transparency is the biggest problem in the financial sector compared to any others. The financial sector makes its money by the customers not having enough knowledge, and also by discouraging the development and sharing of knowledge between customers. And that's something I personally am committed to working on. And for that reason, I'd really love to be in contact with Ross later. The food thing, I popped this into the chat, but what I understand is people in the food industry know that it's unhealthy and causing really big problems.
Yeah.
But they can't, any one of them, act about it because they'll lose their sales. And the only way to make that change it is to have some really creative new approach to regulation of food quality. And that's one area where it's very obvious that that's in the public interest. It'd be amazing that shouldn't happen. But what I understand the food industry does, it quietly backs research that is not independent, where you're begging the question and you know the answer you want. So there you go. That's it from me. But it's been superb. So thank you, everyone, today.
Thanks, Martin. I'm partway through the book by, is it Van Tuken? The chap who's written about ultra processed foods. It's bloody amazing, folks, honestly. The things Emma spoke about earlier, the things that Martin just spoke about now. There are these kind of boffins in the food industry who work out how to get people addicted to the food they want to sell you. They literally sit down and work it out chemically. How do we get the people to want to buy more of our stuff? How do we get people to eat things that make them feel hungrier than before they started? Honestly, it's like we're lab rats. The world's coming to somewhere pretty dodgy. Go on, Em. I can see it itching to come in. Go for it.
Just got to add to that, because I'd say probably 80% of that book is absolutely right, but he is also being paid to write that book by the meat industry to effectively throw all meat alternatives and dairy alternatives under the bus for being not natural. And they are it's a very clever bit of PR, but if you look at his income, it's quite obvious that is the case. And so don't believe everything you read.
That's fascinating. I'll bear that in mind. I'm about a third of the way through it, and I'll bear that in mind when I listen to the rest of it. I'm listening to it
particularly on the studies front. You're right as well. Like all of the meat and dairy studies that had shown, if you look, always go behind and see who funded the study.
That's a key point. It goes back to that thing about Charlie Munger. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Thank you so much, Emma. You've really contributed a nice dimension to. We don't normally talk about food and stuff. It's nice to have you with us tonight. It's been a great conversation you've got us going on here, Peter. It really has been. We'll go back to Mark Bannister and then we'll start bringing the session to a close. Mark.
Emma, I was just going to, I put it in the chat. There was a book that I read a review about called Land Smart by Tom Heap. And Tom Heap is quite well known in the UK because he does Countryfile, a lot on Countryfile. Anyway, he's just written this book about how we've got to stop we've got to use land better, and not eat so much meat, because it's unsustainable and all the rest of it. And we've got to find other ways of eating protein, and that'll be much better for us physically as humans, and also it'll make the environment more sustainable and everything else. I have no idea whether the book has merit or not, whether who he's written it and what his motivations are. I'm completely ignorant of. I can only hope that they're good, but it did seem to me in the review to be actually quite interesting and a worthwhile subject. So I just offer that to you. And Peter, again, I thank you for your contributions and your insight. It's a very worthwhile job, because this is an enormous problem. We've got to find a way of solving it to go forward. I personally think that this whole business around motivation, financial motivation and reward, we've got to go somewhere with this, because it's polluting everything that's happening, and it's undermining some very, very good people who have very good intent, but it is completely trashed by those that don't. And it seems to be a circumstance, as is inevitable in all of these situations, where those with the greatest motivation, which is often not good, rise to the top, and those with the good intent don't. And that's a very unfortunate situation to be in. And personally, I think increasingly that politicians should be like US presidents, a maximum of 2 terms only, and that we should see it that people are constantly flowing through, and they understand that they're there for a very limited time to make a very limited contribution. So they can't waste a day. They've got to get on with it, and they've got to drive change and forward. And the other thing that I despair of is that we have a 2-party system, and everybody may know on the House of Commons floor, there are 2 red lines either side of the benches, and they are, wait for it, you can't transgress the red line on either side, because back in the olden days, they were sufficiently far apart that at a sword's length, you couldn't actually skewer your opposition. As an electorate myself, no, that's the honest to God truth, Andy. That's why they're there. That's from history. So I don't want my government or my opposition to be a government or an opposition. I want everybody who's in that parliament spending every day trying to improve my life and the life of all the other citizens in the country. I do not think that that is best achieved by fighting each other. It drives me nuts. PMQs, it is a weekly illustration of what we should not do. Imagine that you went into an office and you ran a company by division and disagreement. The thing would fold before it began.
Well said, Mark. And you really should feel a bit more confident about speaking out and expressing your views, Mark, rather than holding back. I'm joking. Lovely to have you with us. We're going to go to Peter Geoghegan, author of Democracy for Self, his final thoughts before I formally close our conversation. Peter, back to you. It's been fantastic, Peter. It really has.
So I've really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you so much. I found this really interesting. It's one of the most interesting sessions I've done. I've done hundreds, because this book came out during the pandemic. I did a lot of these Zoom calls, but this I found really interesting questions, really good contributions. Got me thinking too as well about the financial services more. I've done some stuff in the financial services, but it's definitely got my brain sparking a bit too, and thinking actually there's more to be done there as well, and thinking about all these issues that you raised. So no, all I can just say is thank you very much for being such an open and inquisitive and engaged audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to make a couple of quick points. First of all, I'm going to talk about the march that we had in Dublin on September the 18th, I think it was. It was the March for Justice. We had loads of people. Peter, we started off at the Four Courts, then to Dublin Castle, then to Bank of Ireland at College Green, then to Leinster House, and we were involved in a meeting in Leinster House the day after. And the reason I want to mention the march is because we had loads of banners, and there was this particular banner that I'm going to share with you now when I get to it. Bear with me a second. This one here, I think, yeah. Oh, forgive me, I'm a little bit awry. Here we go. So you can see this. We had this Robert F. Kennedy quote on an 8-foot by 4-foot banner, and we dragged it around the streets of Dublin. And it's a quote that we in Transparency Task Force are getting a lot of wisdom from, a lot of guidance from, if that's the right phrase. It's helping to really sharpen our thinking, and it comes at a time when the world was a very, very different place to what it is now. It comes from a time in the early 60s when there was a lot of progressive thinking in the US, and it comes from Robert F. Kennedy, and I actually feel a little bit upset, frankly, thinking about comparing the message in this quotation from what we are frequently hearing about. Bear with me a second, folks. I just need to find it again. I've lost it on my screen. Because obviously, right now there are people going into voting booths in the US, putting their X's one place or another, and if we contrast the vibe, the paradigm between where we are in the US in 2024 and where it was in 1961 when Robert F. Kennedy made this particular speech, things really are rather different to then to what they are now. Every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. Robert F. Kennedy, 1961. It's been a fascinating conversation, Peter. I'm left thinking, I wonder what Robert F. Kennedy and people like him would be thinking about the state of politics around the world today and about the narrative around the US election today and what might be happening in quite literally just the next few days. I think that we should all try to do whatever we can do to try to make the world a better place, because even if it's too late to do much for our own generation, you know, if the rot is so far set in that it's not really going to make much difference over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it might make a difference for our kids and our kids' kids in generations to come. If we can just change the trajectory of travel by 1 degree, then in decades to come, it might make a real difference. I said at the beginning of the Broad Summit last week, one of the biggest mistakes we can make is to actually underestimate our collective ability to make a difference. As Margaret Mead said so well, so eloquently, never doubt what a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can do. In fact, the only people that ever have made a real difference are small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens, the kind of people who read books like what Peter's written, the kind of people that have written books and read books as we've been discussing tonight. We'll wrap it up there, folks. Fingers crossed that things are reasonably sane in the US over the next few days, but whether they are or whether they're not, hopefully we'll all come out of it the other side and have an opportunity to do what we can to make the world a better place. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Peter, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, guys. All the best.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Good night all. Good night all.